we rolling? Look what finally came in the mail. It's the brand new Hero 8. I don't really live the GoPro lifestyle, so I have nothing to film with it yet. But I'm hoping something random comes up where I can use it. But for now, some quick verdicts. The new boost and high modes in Hyper Boost are very, very good. But they're not available in 4K 60, which is a bit of a disappointment because the video kind of made it look like it was. Hypersmooth 2.0 is available, but it's kind of only the base version. So I really like these new feet. They're kind of built in, so you can just flip them down. But here comes the main problem I have with this. The lens cover used to be replaceable on the old GoPros. So basically if you scratched it, you could kind of just twist it off and then change it out. You can't do that anymore on this. So I've had to buy a £20 GoPro screen protector, which they sell. And I'm gonna soon have to get a case to put it in, because that still doesn't seem like it's gonna do much. Oh, and one more thing, they changed the battery, so you can still use your old Hero 7 batteries, but you get this very, very annoying message that comes up. Not really sure what features are limited. I presume what's part of Hypersmooth 2.0. But yeah, so that's it for the GoPro. But anyway, this video is not about the Hero 8. It's actually about this. So this was our first ever cinema camera. It's the URSA 4K EF. As you can tell, this tripod is not meant to hold this camera. That is one of the things I'm going to explain later. So, this camera has come to the end of its life and we are basically retiring it. And I just want to kind of make a video on lessons that we learned buying our first cinema camera, because boy, we were not ready for it when we bought it. So lesson number one is the weight of this camera. Body alone, it is 7.4 kilograms. It's quite difficult to kind of say how heavy that is in person, but like, we got this thinking it was going to be run and gun. Our shoulders literally died. And so part of the reason why it's so heavy is because it's designed for crew use. You have one touchscreen over here where you can add metadata and do all your cool stuff. You have visual audio meters. You've got full-size XLRs with phantom power. And then on this side, you have this huge 10-inch screen. Makes focus pulling really easy. And you have another screen over here, which is basically identical to the screen over here. It is this all-metal body. It's also liquid-cooled, which I think added to why it was so heavy. And then on the bottom, you have this VCT-14 mount with these rails, which is super handy. But basically, to mount it on anything, you had to buy a VCT-14 plate, and this Sony one cost us like £350 or something. Which basically neatly brings me on to lesson number 2 that we learned, which is the accessories for it. Effectively, because of how heavy the camera was, we had to replace our entire accessories lineup. For things like tripods and like any sliders that we had, not a chance that they were gonna work. And then I guess the third problem I had, which most people had with this camera, was the sensor lies. Blackmagic, when they released this camera, claimed that it was gonna be an upgradable camera. This turret at the front, effectively you could pull it off and then replace it with something else, like a brand new 4.6K sensor. That never happened. And to this day, people I think might still be waiting. When we did contact Blackmagic, all they offered us was like a discount on the URSA Mini, which at the time, we were kind of like, well, we've just saved up money to buy this camera. Why would we possibly want to spend more money on a camera that isn't this camera? And I mean, that does kind of anger me to this day about it, and I wish Blackmagic would do something about it. So I guess that's enough of me talking. Let's kind of rig it and switch it on. I'm gonna show you effectively the original rig that we had, which was the cheapest accessories we could possibly find to get this thing up and running. So here we go. So like I said, the first thing that we had to get was a VCT-14 plate. With the plate in place, the camera kind of slides on. How satisfying is that? Now, the first thing you're gonna need is a way to power this. When you buy it, it comes with its power cable, but obviously not really good for kind of field use. So we ended up getting the V-mount battery. This was the cheapest V-mount battery we could find. It is a 90 watt-hour battery made by the cheap Chinese company Newer. At the time, it was literally the only thing we could afford. So this kind of slides in here. And there we go. Super handy because there's a D-tap and a USB over here, and then there's another D-tap over here. So the lens that we used on this at the time was the 24-105 f4L from Canon, except I just realized I'm filming with it right now. So I'm gonna have to use this Helios 44M to demonstrate. By the way, I should add, we did get the EF version because we had a lot of EF glass at the time. To install the lens, you kind of just line up the red lines and then it clicks into place. Look how stupid this thing looks, how big the body is and this tiny little lens. So with these rails down here, basically we would hide them in the body for storage and then kind of pull them out to wherever you needed them and then lock them back into place. These are standard 15mm rails, so you can kind of mount whatever cheap accessories you want, which is exactly what we ended up doing. So cheap accessory number one was a very, very basic follow focus kit. Start by tightening this up, so it actually turns, there we go. And then we take the actual follow focus kit and kind of just slide it right up. And with that done, we can pull focus. So I guess the next bit's a little bit controversial, which is a cheap matte box, which basically isn't doing much. It quite literally just makes the camera look a little bit bigger and was a compensator for like the tiny little EF lenses we used to use on this thing. One thing I will say, which is despite the performance not being that great for a camera this big, clients used to love it just because of how big it was. You can tell how stupid this is. The front of the lens doesn't even match up with the matte box because the follow focus is in the way. But you kind of get the point. So let's boot it up and I will show you what it looks like. For a cinema camera, this thing booted really quickly. I remember dry hiring the Red One MX once and I was like, dear God, this thing is like a computer booting up. It took so long. And then one final thing was for sound. We used to use this, which was the Rode NTG1. It's kind of like the most basic broadcast grade audio solution that we could think of. Okay, so with that in there, this is what it looks like basically. I guess I'll start by showing you what this side does. Okay, so over on this side, I guess this is kind of like the first AC side is the best way to describe it. These screens, by the way, are all individually controllable. So as I cycle between, you can kind of see what we're actually seeing, and then the menu. All the settings you could change on here, which is super handy. But a lot of the time, we just stick this in kind of like the actual feed of the camera and then just pull focus with this side. One thing I did love were these physical audio meters, which was really nice just to be able to see. And then you literally have these dials here that you can actually just turn. On the back here, we've got these SDI in-outs and time codes and references. This was one of the big selling points about why we bought this camera. This camera does 12G SDI out, which meant that it could do a 4K 60 feet, the same as what our studio cameras did straight into our A10. So I guess the biggest reason why we bought this camera was because it works as a studio camera and kind of a filming camera. You can stick it in video or film mode, and in video mode it did sort of the same kind of Rec 709 style image that the studio cameras used to give, just with a much better dynamic range. Over on this side, you've got this big fold-out screen. This is the 10-inch screen I was talking about. It's not a touchscreen. Program input was super handy because you could see the feed of the ATEM if you had it kind of plugged in via the 12G SDI return. And then over here you've got the same kind of layout again. This screen, while it looks identical to this screen, and it does the same thing, they are individually controllable. So you can have kind of settings open on this one, and then have kind of focus peaking on this one, for example. And then finally this camera records onto dual CFast 2.0 cards, which is another thing. My God, was CFast 2.0 cards expensive back then. So I guess we'll talk about performance of this camera, and then I will do some real world tests. I promise we'll do real world tests. This is the version 2 sensor of this camera. The reason we waited for version 2 was because the V1 had a couple of issues. By the way, these are issues that we thought were going to be fixed. They really were not fixed. And number one, I guess the main reason is this worked as a slow motion camera as well. This thing does 4K at 120 FPS continuous. It's not like the burst mode that you get in the FS700. This thing did it continuously. And that is one of the things that these dual CFast cards were used for. Whilst these are dual CFast 2.0 slots, they do not do any kind of like simultaneous or relay recording. They're purely used in this kind of striped RAID 0 style performance mode. When you were recording in RAW in this camera, it would alternate between them. It records in cinema DNG. So each frame was a kind of still DNG RAW image, and it would go frame 1, frame 2, frame 3, frame 4, and so on. And then I guess the next thing is codecs. This thing did full RAW in cinema DNG, like I said, RAW 3:1, and then basically every single ProRes format. We only ever shot in 2 of the formats. The first one was RAW 3:1. That's what we use basically for any kind of client projects that we shot. And then ProRes Proxy, which is the absolute lowest this thing does. And that would be used for extended takes for anything that we were just kind of recording. But the thing about the ProRes options are, and including the proxies, every single ProRes option is a 10-bit codec. Like even the proxy that you'd imagine to be the kind of the lowest scrapped version is far better than anything you'll get in a consumer DSLR. So going back to what version 2 of the firmware means, I've had to close my blinds to film this bit, so I do apologize if it suddenly gets really, really grainy. But anyway, the main way you could tell that it was version 2 was because the sensor would go up to 120 FPS, whereas the V1 would only go up to 80 FPS. And I guess the other reason that we waited for the V2 was because we thought, well, the black hole problem would be fixed. For those of you that don't know, the black hole problem is basically an issue that's existed with a lot of CMOS sensors, and the The Red 1 MX especially was quite bad with this. Effectively, if you point your camera into the sun, you get this weird black hole, except the black hole's actually purple. It used to ruin takes in a really weird way. It's quite easy to avoid directly pointing it into the sun, but if the sun was shining onto a reflective surface, like for example a car, that would often show up. And in the field, it's really difficult to tell that unless you're specifically kind of looking for it. So yeah, we thought that was going to be fixed, and then that didn't get fixed. That's kind of it for now. I'm going to show you guys some real world tests, I guess. It is a bit overcast out there, but it should kind of allow for quite even lighting for you guys to kind of gauge what it looks like.
Time for some footage from this camera. I took the camera out and shot in a number of different codecs, all in 4K using the Canon 24-105 f4L. This is a bit of a useless test for codecs because of YouTube's compression, so consider this more sort of a final web distribution look of what this camera produces. Here's a clip shot in 3:1 RAW where I've set the white balance incorrectly, resulting in this horrible blue image. But using the RAW tools in DaVinci Resolve, you can see that I'm pretty much able to get it back to where I need it to be. Now for these next few clips I've underexposed the footage to highlight what is in my opinion the biggest issue with this camera, and it's the fixed pattern noise that you can see. This is a very brief video on this camera, and I've said very little about things like the global shutter and the fixed pattern noise. So head on over to the OGC Media channel where we've got a much more in-depth video on this camera which goes through things like the menus, codecs, dynamic range and record times.
So in terms of run and gun, this is kind of our setup. Take the VCT14 plate off, then start by installing this kind of small rig shoulder pad thing. By the way, this camera was not designed to be shoulder mounted, but when we were out there were no dollies available for less than about 10,000. This was the only option we had. So I've taken the matte box and the follow focus off to kind of better demonstrate what this kind of shoulder rig setup would look like. But effectively, the pad would go here on where we thought the sort of center of gravity was. And then for the arm sort of handle component of this rail, we had to build this very DIY solution. So here we have another 50mm rail on a 50mm rail joint right here. You're probably wondering what this box that I've got velcroed underneath here is. This is a SDI to HDMI converter. Now the reason for that will become very clear in a bit. And that's kind of the basic setup. It looks like it's shoulder mountable, except wait, there's no EVF on this thing. But oh look, a 10-inch screen. Except watch what happens when I fold out the 10-inch screen. The 10-inch screen is quite literally touching my chin already. Therefore, as you can imagine, this was not very usable. I guess Blackmagic saw this coming because what they included underneath here is quite clever. There is a 3G SDI out, effectively for EVFs, as well as a 4-pin XLR 12V out for you to power that. But here's the problem. EVFs, and EVFs that use SDI especially, are basically kind of the price of half of this camera. It just wasn't something we could afford. So we kind of had to go with the only thing which we could afford, which was just a Lilliput field monitor. This one is the A7S. I know, it's a terrible name. And then one of these arms from Small Rig, and that would give you a little bit more, but still not a great deal of room. And so yeah, now it sits there, so you can kind of see better. So basically, 3G SDI would come out of there, go into this box, and then HDMI out would go into here. For battery, you can take a Sony NP kind of battery, or you can just take a 12V out. That's fairly easy and cheap to do. So yeah, as you can see, it's just not a very kind of run and gun camera at all. This camera is basically a studio camera, and if you do use it outside, it's designed to be used with a very big crew where you have a lot of support. But there you kind of have it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you're wondering what we're getting as a replacement, it's the most obvious one. It's the URSA Mini 4.6K. So there we go, guys. Hope you enjoyed this video. Hopefully some of the life lessons that we learned are kind of relevant to you so that you don't end up making the same mistakes that we did. In short, we spent about half the price of this camera just buying accessories to get it to work. In case you're kind of wondering what this camera will be used for in the future, well, it is being retired, but it does one thing that most other cameras don't do, which is 4K at 120 FPS. So I guess it'll be used as a kind of really cheap phantom for us, if you even class 120 FPS as... One thing I will say this camera absolutely does excel at is green screen use, even in the ProRes, because you can go up to XQ and 4444 in a 12-bit flavor. It's really good for green screen use. So there we have it, guys. Hopefully I'll have another video on the URSA Mini 4.6K when it actually comes out. But for now, thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.